The new post-liberal fascism, a Polish perspective. For years, we have been frightened by a fascist wave sweeping across the Western world. But what we are actually dealing with is not one wave, but a head-on collision of two fascist waves, flowing from opposite ideological poles of the world of bourgeois politics. On one side, we have the old, well-known conservative and anti-immigrant fascism. On the other, a new post-liberal fascism, brutal chauvinism and militarism based on Russophobia, and in Germany, also in Palestinophobia. The new post-liberal fascism promotes, first, genocidal policies towards populations deemed hostile to the West, and second, the criminalization of actual or perceived allies of these populations in Western societies. These allies are, of course, branded as traitors and agents of Putin or Hamas. Marxists, I think, do not yet see the new post-liberal fascism. They don't understand that yesterday's liberals, yesterday's social democrats, and yesterday's Greens are no longer liberals, social democrats, or Greens, but fascists. But fascists still using the old liberal, social democratic, or green terminology. Post-liberal fascists themselves also don't understand that they have become fascists. They may think that they are simple militant defenders of liberal orthodoxy. Post-liberal fascism comes under the banner of a false anti-fascism. The false anti-fascism describes the enemies of the West as fascists. This applies to both external enemies and internal enemies. The internal enemy is the old school conservative fascists like Trump, the AfD, or Marine Le Pen. They are in the narrative of false anti-fascism agent or imitators of external fascists like Putin. The use of the banner of false anti-fascism by the new fascists causes even Marxists to succumb to certain illusions and continue to believe in the existence of only one model of fascism, and therefore believe that liberals are still liberals, i.e. non-fascists, and perhaps even anti-fascists. Many Marxists believe that the fight against fascism is simply a fight against the political forces defined as far-right. And the worst of these Marxists believe that against fascism defined in this way, we should build a broad front with all the forces that don't want the far right to come to power. The emergence of completely new type of fascism imposes new theoretical tasks on us. I would like to present to you my list of key theoretical questions and also share with you my working answers to these questions. Okay, task one, the current definition of fascism. For a long time, we could believe that fascists had to be first, opponents of the system that Marxists define as bourgeois democracy. For a long time, we could assume that fascists sought to establish a different form of capitalist state. Second, fascists were associated with ethnic nationalism. Third, fascists were associated with conservatism, i.e. homophobia and male chauvinism. Today, however, we see that brutal militaristic chauvinism can function without these features. Modern chauvinism does not need either ethnic nationalism or conservatism, nor does it seek to change the form of the state. Instead of ethnic nationalism, it rather appeals to political nationalism, which claims that the ethnic origin of a citizen is not important. A legitimate member of the nation must first and foremost identify with the political and geopolitical line of the state, must accept state violence against internal and external enemies defined by the state. Modern militaristic chauvinism does not require the elimination of traditional political parties operating within the framework of so-called bourgeois democracy. So, what is the essence of fascism? My answer has two elements. First, fascism is an ideology, which means that a fascist state is simply a state that proclaims fascist ideology. By saying that fascism is an ideology, I'm saying that fascism is not a particular system of capitalist states, nor a particular model of capitalism, nor a particular model of relation between state, capital, and masses. Second element, fascist ideology is an anti-humanist ideology in a brutal, potentially genocidal form. I need to explain what I mean by anti-humanist ideology. Pro-capitalist political parties can be arranged according to their distance from two axiological poles. The first is pseudo-humanism, the most popular variety of which is democratic pseudo-humanism. This is an ideology that advocates that all people should be liberated by bourgeois democracy and human rights. This ideology rejects chauvinism, the struggle between people, and the struggle between nations. This ideology is advocated by liberals, social democrats, and Greens. The second pole is anti-humanism. Anti-humanism rejects the peaceful cooperation of all people for their common good. According to anti-humanists, struggle between people is a natural state or even desirable. The most popular variety of anti-humanism is pseudo-collectivism, which claims that a person must be a soldier of his national pseudo-community in its fight against other pseudo-communities, defend its purity, expose traitors and outsiders. Old-style fascists are people who have always been pseudo-collectivists. On the other hand, new post-liberal fascists are people who were pseudo-humanist yesterday and today represent brutal anti-humanism in a pseudo-collectivist variant. They differ from old-style fascists in that they define the community they want to defend differently. Of course, this community, or rather pseudo-community, in both cases has two levels, national and general Western. Let us focus on the latter level, the Western community. For conservative fascists, the Western community is the community of the white man or Christian civilization. For post-liberal fascists, it is a community defined by the old pseudo-humanist language, the community of democracy and human rights. The connotation of these terms becomes very unclear, but these terms still denote the social political system of the West. Since the current connotation of terms like democracy is a mystery, they actually function in the language of post-liberal fascists as proper names for the Western system. So the only indisputable answer to the question, what is democracy and what are human rights, is democracy and human rights are what we have in the West. Post-liberal fascists prefer these names because of their pseudo-humanist past. By retaining these names, post-liberals can think that they are still liberals. Okay? Task 2, the difference between post-liberal fascism and liberalism. We need to spend some time on the difference between post-liberal fascism and liberalism, because it is a difference that most Marxists do not yet see. Marxism must be critical of both ideologies, but a Marxist critique of post-liberal fascism must be quite different from a Marxist critique of liberalism. We can accuse liberalism of a contradiction between theory and practice, a contradiction between pseudo-humanist theory and anti-humanist practice. Liberals legitimize the anti-humanist social reality of capitalism and the criminal policies of imperialism. and thus legitimize many forms of violence and enslavement. But they legitimize all this with the help of a pseudo-humanist theory, which tells of the liberation of all people through democracy and human rights. Liberal theory does not describe any reality. It describes some parallel reality. But that is precisely why it is coherent and free from fascist element. In the case of post-liberal fascism, however, we are dealing with the opposite situation. This ideology is unfortunately generally true. Its main fascist element is in line with reality, with actual practice. The chauvinistic language used against Russia and their allies, the intrusive propaganda for the militarization of Western societies, the language of contempt for pacifists, all this adequately reflects the actual policies of Western countries. However, this ideology is not coherent. The post-liberal component of this ideology is in contradiction with the fascist component. This component is also in contradiction with reality. Our critique of post-liberal fascism must point out both that its main fascist component is unfortunately true and that its post-liberal component is unfortunately false. Let us now look at the contradiction between the post-liberal component and reality. We may doubt whether there is a contradiction here. Post-liberal fascism inherited the terms from liberalism, but rejected their liberal connotation. The current connotation of terms such as democracy or human rights remains a mystery, which means that these terms actually function as proper names of the Western system. It follows that the violation of human rights can be called defense of human rights. If we accept that human rights, if human rights is just a proper name of the Western system, we must assume that defense of human rights is simply fighting the opponents of the West. Everything that the allies of the West do in the fight against opponents of the West is defense of human rights. Because defense of human rights is simply a fight for Western domination. To say that the West violates human rights is a statement burdened with a logical contradiction, because human rights is simply something that is in the West or something that the West gives to its colonies. As we can see, the contradiction between the post-liberal element of contemporary fascism and reality disappears because it is simply logically impossible. But this contradiction disappears only seemingly. Post-liberal fascists are not the only users of the terms of liberal language. These terms are associated with certain ideas and emotions. These are completely different ideas and emotions than those to which Goebbels' language appeals. This contradiction does not disappear, and therefore must be mitigated in some way. Namely, in the narrative of post-liberal fascism, two counter tendencies clash: the chauvinist tendency and the revisionist tendency. The chauvinist tendency directly expresses the main component of this ideology, the fascist component. The chauvinist tendency is describing Russians and pro-Russian people as pathetic but dangerous subhumans who simply need to be exterminated or trained. This tendency adequately expresses the attitude of post-liberal fascists towards opponents of the West. The chauvinist tendency eliminates the liberal connotation of terms inherited from liberalism, reducing these terms to proper names. The revisionist tendency, on the other hand, restores the liberal connotations of these terms, but this does not mean that post-liberal fascists appeal to the Ukrainian authorities to respect human rights. No. This only involves creating a parallel reality. Liberals were very good at this. they were able to talk about an anti-humanist reality in a very humanistic way. Their post-liberal sons and daughters inherited from them the ability to create a parallel reality. In this parallel reality, the inhabitants of Donbass are no longer subhumans who must be exterminated, but victims of Russian fascist violence. Ukraine's mission is to liberate them. Ukraine is also fighting to save LGBT people who are threatened by Putin's homophobic regime. Ukraine is fighting to save our planet from Russian eco-terrorism, to defend women's rights from Russian sexism, to defend workers' rights from brutal oligarchic Russian capitalism, and so on and so forth. The revisionist tendency also applies to the past. World War II was not a war in which the Red Army crushed fascism, but a war of two fascisms, Stalinist and Hitlerite, which jointly attacked the free world, but at some point fell out with each other. The Ukrainian nationalists who fought against the Soviet Union in World War II were in fact anti-fascists fighting against Soviet fascism, and so on. The revisionist tendency suits the discomfort that people who were liberals yesterday and who have become Goebbels' disciples must feel. But the revisionist tendency cannot gain a clear advantage over the chauvinist tendency. Both tendencies must remain in balance with each other. After all, post-liberal fascists want to transform the population of Western societies into an army of tough and disciplined Western fighters. Pacifist attitudes and humanist sensibilities must be eradicated in the training process. And the training process is precisely chauvinist and militarist propaganda. The revisionist tendency is supposed to provide people with a sense of continuity between their past and present worldviews. But this tendency cannot drown out the chauvinist tendency, because it is a chauvinist tendency that plays a key role in the political project of post-liberal fascism. Task 3, the social base of the new fascism. The problem of the social base of fascism must be separated from the problem of whose interests does fascism serve. Now we are interested in the problem of which social group identifies most strongly with post-liberal fascism. In my opinion, this group is the intelligentsia, but not all of it. Within the intelligentsia, there has long been an ideological division between the conservative intelligentsia, which defends national religious traditions and creates a national mythology, and the so-called progressive intelligentsia, which advocates modernization, the fight against backwardness, and cooperation with other nations. It is the so-called progressive intelligentsia that is the social subject of post-liberal fascism. The so-called progressive intelligentsia used to be a group that was actually progressive. In the 1940s, in connection with the victory of the Red Army over fascism and the prospect of building socialism in the backward countries of Central and Eastern Europe, a large part of the progressive intelligentsia, also in Poland, switched to pro-communist positions. Later, in the second half of the 1950s, the process of the so-called progressive intelligentsia switching from pro-communist position to positions of pseudo-humanist anti-communism began. Currently, the so-called progressive intelligentsia is breaking away from pseudo-humanism and is becoming the main subject of post-liberal fascism. Although it is currently an extremely reactionary group, I will use the term progressive intelligentsia as a proper name, the denotation of which is obvious. The progressive intelligentsia was fundamentally opposed to chauvinism when chauvinism took the form of anti-Semitism. In Poland, anti-Semitism was always directed against the progressive intelligentsia. As a cosmopolitan group alienated from the nation, a group a large part of which were people of Jewish origin. In the last decades of the People's Republic of Poland, the progressive intelligentsia played a leading role within the anti-communist opposition. But a large part of this opposition was distrustful of it. Its representatives were not considered to be true Poles, but sons and daughters of Jewish communists. The situation of this group was therefore ambiguous. On the one hand, the progressive intelligentsia played a major role in Poland's political life. On the other hand, they had a strong sense of alienation from the Polish nation. I think that today's Russophobic chauvinism satisfies an important need of the progressive intelligentsia. Russophobic chauvinism gives this group a sense of being rooted in the nation. The progressive intelligentsia previously excluded from the group of true Poles, today, thanks to Russophobia, itself defines who is true Pole and who is an agent of Russia. The hatred of the progressive intelligentsia toward Russia is, in fact, a transformed hatred of the intelligentsia towards the popular masses. Political views that are unpopular in the progressive intelligentsia environment, but popular among the popular masses, are automatically defined by the progressive intelligentsia as pro-Russian views. The idea of the West domination the East is, in fact, a transformed form of the idea of political domination of the progressive intelligentsia over the backward popular masses. I have stated earlier that the current connotation of the concept of democracy remains a mystery. Why is that? Well, because it is a connotation that is completely opposite to the etymology of this term, of the term democracy, people's power. The contradiction between the connotation and etymology of the concept of democracy exposes the hypocrisy of the intelligentsia, which is why this connotation should not be revealed to the general public. It can only be gently suggested. Let us reveal, however, what the current connotation on the concept of democracy is. Namely, democracy is the rule of progressive intelligentsia over the people, the rule of a minority over the majority. So, the rule of the majority is populism, the rule of the minority is democracy. Of course, this connotation is much older than post-liberal fascism. It is a product of classical liberalism. But it is only post-liberal fascism that unabashedly proclaims that political opponents of progressive intelligentsia must be brutally fought and stigmatized as enemies of democracy, i.e. agents of Russia. Democracy is therefore a brutal dictatorship of progressive intelligentsia, defining opponents of progressive intelligentsia as enemies of democracy. If we transfer the idea of democracy, understood in this way, to the level of international relations, we obtain the idea of the rule of the enlightened West over the backward East and South. The idea of political neutralization of the East and South. For the progressive intelligentsia in Poland, Russophobia is a religion. This group does not act rationally. This is not about any material interests, I think, but about symbolic interests. First, the intelligentsia wants to unrestrainedly manifest its specific identity, an elite identity that distinguishes progressive intelligentsia from ordinary people. Second, thanks to Russophobia, the intelligentsia gains a sense of power, a sense of agency, a sense of exercising hegemony in the ideological sphere. If the essence of the identity of a true Pole is anti-Semitism, the progressive intelligentsia is symbolically excluded from the Polish nation. That it is why that progressive intelligentsia dreams of replacing anti-Semitism with Russophobia. The progressive intelligentsia believes that thanks to this, it will no longer be an excluded group, but a hegemonic group, a group deciding who is a true Pole. Task 4, the population that fascism wants to destroy. Fascism always has an external and internal enemy. The internal enemy is always linked to the external enemy. If we ignore the Palestinian-Israeli issue, which plays a major role in Germany, but not in Central and Eastern Europe, the main external enemy of post-liberal fascism is Russia and the pro-Russian population. And the internal enemy is the political forces in Europe that question the policy of confrontation with Russia. However, we need to take a close look at the population the post-liberal fascism treats as an external enemy. At first glance, post-liberal fascists support Ukrainian nationalists against Russian nationalists. It must be admitted that Russian nationalism opposed to Putin tried to play a certain role in this conflict, tried to build its political influence in Donbass and Novorossiya. But Russian nationalism does not adequately express the consciousness of the people of Donbass and Novorossiya. Let us emphasize this clearly. Russian nationalism is in conflict with both the political tradition of Donbass and Putin's political doctrine. In fact, the people of Donbass and Novorossiya are part of a broader community that we should call the Soviet nation. The Soviet Union no longer exists, but people who identify with the Soviet tradition, with the cultural space of the former Soviet Union, still exists. The Soviet Union was a federation of national republics, but individual national republics included areas that were multinational and multicultural, such as the Donbass. Moreover, during the existence of the Soviet Union, the process of national consciousness being replaced by the all-Soviet consciousness took place in ethnically homogeneous areas as well. The historical events that radically strengthened the all-Soviet consciousness was the victory of Red Army over fascism in World War II. It was a common victory of all nations and all ethnic groups of the Soviet Union. This great victory of the multinational population of the Soviet Union is the source of the Soviet anti-fascist ethos. The anti-fascist ethos is hatred of fascism and its positive content, solidarity with all the anti... Oh, okay. Okay, no problem. Okay. Okay. In task 4, okay, we should defend Soviet nation. And task 5. Okay. Due to time constraints, I will shorten the last part to a few sentences. Initially, post-liberal fascism was an ideology that the United States imposed of the European Union. After Trump's election victory, we are dealing with the opposite situation. It is the countries of European Union that proclaim post-liberal fascism in opposition to Trump. In connection with this, a theoretical question arises. Is the policy of confrontation with Russia consistent with the interests of European capital? My hypothesis is that Europe cannot move away from aggressive anti-Russian policy too quickly for political reasons, because the elites of the European Union would have to admit that they lied about Russia. Therefore, Europe is changing its business model to adapt the interests of European capital to the policy of confrontation with Russia. But such an adaptation can end in a great disaster. The ideologies of post-liberal fascism do not care about this because the progressive intelligentsia does not think rationally about the interests of capitalists from their own countries. The progressive intelligentsia is primarily concerned with the ideological hegemony of the West, because this hegemony is associated with its own ideological hegemony over the masses. This is why the ideology of post-liberal fascism may prove dangerous from the point of view of the interests of European capital. In the case of Poland, we have a very interesting situation. Post-liberal fascists demand the complete integration of Ukraine with the West, although this would be this would be a dead for the weak Polish bourgeoisie, which has no chance of competing with Ukrainian oligarchs. The Polish government speaks the language of post-liberal fascists, but it must also take care of the interests of the Polish bourgeoisie. Therefore, in reality, the policy of the Polish government is not as pro-Ukrainian as the official ideology claims. Thank you very much.